Okay, so who the hell are Aurora 44 and how do they manage to make a game this good on their first try? And they're from New Zealand of all places. New Zealand sucks!
The dark is older than the light. At last a day dawned, and we rose with this first light.
One of the great tragedies of 2018 is that Ashen came out and almost nobody knew about it. Ashen is a game that was in development for several years with a promised release date of 2018. I maintain a calendar of release dates so I can plan what I'm going to review, but as we slid listlessly into December, utterly spent from the relentless span of blockbuster after blockbuster, I'd all but given up hope that Ashen was coming out this year. I was awaiting the press release announcing the delay, and I look forward to playing it in 2019 as though there'd be any time for that. Lo and behold, at the Game Awards, Aurora 44 rolled their trailer and announced that this game was now available right then and there, exclusive to the Xbox and the Epic Games Store. PS4 users, you guys are out of luck. Xbox basically published this thing through their ID at Xbox program, so it's likely that you're never going to see a PS4 release. Steam users, you can expect a release at some point, but it's unclear when that will be. For now, if you own a PC, you'll have to get it on the Epic Games Store. It's a storefront that I'm not a fan of, but that's a topic for another video. So, what is Ashen and why am I so enamored of it? Firstly, let's deal with the elephant in the room. Ashen is basically Dark Souls Jr. I know it's cool to get mad at game journalists and YouTubers who lean too heavily into the Dark Souls comparisons.
Meaning just a few scattered clouds to pepper your Sunday evening.
Looks like it's gonna be the Dark Souls of weather!
But Ashen is so Dark Souls that any effort to avoid comparisons would just end up making the whole discussion labored and obtuse. Ashen is like Dark Souls. If that triggers you...
Well then, son, you've got a condition.
Now, I've played pretty much every Souls-like game ever made, or at least most of them, and I think that of all of those games, Ashen does the best job of providing the raw, essential elements of the formula in a way that is accessible to newer players. It's simpler, easier, and more streamlined than anything that has come before it. It's by no means better than Demon Souls, Dark Souls, or Bloodborne, but it's the perfect primer to those other experiences. And I think it immediately earns an important place in the genre because of its utility as a starting point. But to position Ashen as only Dark Souls for beginners is to do it grave injustice. Beyond its accomplished handling of the Souls-like fundamentals, Ashen is imbued with its own virtues that set it apart from its contemporaries and that make it a terrifically worthwhile experience. So, let's talk about those things.
There are those that thrive in perpetual night and would extinguish these fledgling rays. We must find the Ashen and protect it from the Elder Dark.
If there's one thing that Souls-like games share, it's their brooding, dark, pessimistic tone. They're always set in doomed worlds, recently ruined worlds getting more ruined by the day, or worlds long since doomed and ruined. It complements the brutal struggle of the unforgiving gameplay, but Ashen reminds us that it need not always be the case. Ashen has at its core a bleary-eyed optimism, as the world has just awoken from a dark slumber and it's your job to kickstart the rebuilding process. This rebuilding takes on a literal form in the township you make your base of operations. As you progress through the game, you'll meet a variety of NPCs and invite them back to your town, and as you complete more and more quests for them, you'll notice that each NPC has been busy building suitable housing and shop fronts, providing an enlarged suite of goods and services to you as they do so. It's a small but satisfying touch, and you'll derive no small enjoyment from clearing out an area of the map, unlocking the fast travel point, and then eagerly returning to your town to see how it's evolved as the result of your labours. The pervasive sense of optimism runs deeper than this, though. NPCs are fully voiced and have surprisingly cheery and playful dispositions.
Don't know if it was the listeners or someone else, but Fiske got bought off. His weapons weren't nearly as nasty before. Some skegghead's been giving him pointers.
The game's soundtrack is more off to highlight the beauty of your surroundings than to provide an unnecessary sense of foreboding. thing seems rather bright, not at all times mind you, but certainly enough of the time, whereby this quality stands out and sets it well apart from other games in the genre. Tonally, I found Ashen to be pitch perfect. For as much as I love Souls games for their challenge, I do struggle a little bit with the relentless darkness of their worlds and their stories. On the topic of story, you'll notice that Ashen handles its NPCs and quests in a very different way than most other Souls games. The genre really likes doing this thing where the NPCs are melancholic and laconic. They'll mutter a few almost nonsensical words, and from these you're to divine an objective or a critical piece of lore.
Did you ring the second bell? That is incredible, I must say. No, maybe not.
Ashen doesn't do this. Each NPC in Ashen has a journey associated with them, which is a multi-step quest that takes you throughout each of the game's 7 zones. You might have to hunt an animal in one section, return to the NPC, collect an item in another section, return again, kill a specific enemy in a different spot, and so on, until the quest climaxes in the final zone. There's clear instruction provided to you, clear backstory that's easy to follow, and a clear resolution to it all. It's also marked out on your map, so you've got no confusion as to where to go. It's perhaps the best example I can give you of the way that Ashen is more streamlined and accessible to new players, since the circumspect nature of Souls-like quest progression can often be unclear and rob players of a tangible sense of box ticking. This approach won't be for everyone though, and I'll confess that I myself prefer the more mysterious, quizzical, nondescript musings of Dark Souls' characters, as my imagination filled the blanks in a way that Ashen staunchly prohibits. Dark Souls seems deeply considered, intelligent, aloof, and sagely in comparison to the far more overt Ashen, but I respect Aurora 44 for offering this as an alternative, if only because it helps me more deeply understand what I do and don't value within the Souls-like formula. Consistent with Ashen's bucking of tradition, the game is set in a world that is far more beautiful than it is destroyed. This is an absolutely stunning game. The majority of it is set outdoors in forested areas, ash-covered wastelands, coastal villages, shanty towns, and opulent cities. Each location has a visual consistency grounded in the art style that may lead some to criticize it for a lack of variation, but to me it really belies a congruence of world building. Each space leads into the other, and no space seems so different from the world that it feels out of place. This isn't inherently bad, just as the tremendous range of Dark Souls' various locations isn't inherently good. It's just a decision that the developers of each game took, and I think in both games their chosen direction paid off handsomely. I'll make the very important side note as well that this game was technically flawless for me. I ran it in ultra wide at max settings and never dropped below 100 frames, or almost never. I never had one crash or even a major bug during the entire playthrough. I don't know how a studio as new and as small as Aurora 44 could pull off such a technically accomplished game on their first try when so many other studios struggle with hundreds of staff and dozens of releases under their belt, but Aurora did it, and it's absolutely to be commended. Visuals and technicals aside, Ashen plays pretty damn well. The first thing to be said is that the combat loop is very simple. There are one-hand weapons, shields, spears, and two-hand weapons, and while different classes of weapons have subtle differences, they're all functionally largely similar. If you're looking for the depth of Bloodborne's weapon system here, you certainly won't find it. Combat utilizes the light and heavy attack model core to the Souls-like formula, but consistent with Ashen's approach, it's very stripped down. There are no parry or ripostes or backstabs or no advanced movement maneuvers beyond the dodging and rolling. The removal of the more complex combat mechanics doesn't hurt the game for the average player, since most casual Souls-like players ignore these mechanics anyway. For serious fans though, these parts of the combat loop were critical skill breakpoints, and their removal will no doubt leave some Souls-like enthusiasts disappointed. I will say though that Aurora 44 got the feeling of combat very right here. If you played the Surge, you'll know that there's something a little bit off about how combat feels. Too fast at times, too slow in others. The movesets feel sort of stilted and awkward. Ashen keeps things simple, and as a result, they were able to take the time to ensure that each swing felt as it should, with minimal opportunities for hitbox porn montages during my playthrough. So, TLDR for the combat, simple, but good. Much the same could be said of the game's RPG systems, which are infinitely more streamlined than you'll find in any other Souls-like game. You'll collect scoria or souls from killing your enemies, completing quests, or looting corpses, and this will primarily be used to purchase more swigs of your healing flask, making your flask stronger or upgrading your weapon. There are no stats to put experience points into. You'll simply gain more stamina and health every time you complete a quest. Build diversity comes in the form of various talismans and relics you can equip, which provide things like bonus health or bonus damage to enemies when you land successive attacks, or stacking damage protection if you can avoid being hit for long periods of time. I think the test of systems such as these is the question, would I want to play this game again to try a different build? To which the answer here is a resounding no. There simply isn't enough difference between the weapons, relics, and talismans to justify it, so repeated playthroughs would be similar from one playthrough to the next. You certainly could take this commentary on the combat, weapon, and RPG systems as criticism of the game, but I certainly hope you don't. Criticism is about calling out something bad. None of these systems are bad. They all work flawlessly and they're all enjoyable in their own way. They're just far simpler and more streamlined than what other games offer. If this simplicity doesn't bother you, great, but if you're looking for something deeper that allows for more flexibility and customization, then know that Ashen likely isn't for you. For me, much like the rest of Ashen, I welcomed its approach because it was simply something different to experience. In beginning to wrap up, I think we should talk about the X factor that holds the whole Souls-like formula together, and that's difficulty. I contend that you could remove pretty much every other aspect of the Souls-like formula, and as long as the game was still really hard, someone out there is still going to compare it to Dark Souls. Ashen is a decidedly uneven experience as regards to its difficulty, and it's in this one area that I'll offer the most objective criticism that I can. I think a good difficulty curve should look something like this, or perhaps some sort of variation on it, where things get progressively harder as you move through the game at a kind of consistent rate. If I was to plot Ashen's difficulty on a graph, it would look something like this. You'd have a long stretch of really easy game where you just never die, and then you hit your first dungeon and you want to die IRL because of how challenging it is, and then it's easy mode again for a long time until you hit the second dungeon and its final boss, and then it kind of chills out a bit again for a while, and then you hit the final boss, which is pretty tricky. Now, the open world aspect is one of the more easy portions of the game, and it's easy because of two factors: enemy design and level design. There aren't many enemies in Ashen, there's probably only about 15 or 20 in total, and they all have very similar movesets. More than this though, if you're at all familiar with Souls-like combat, most of the enemies aren't going to be throwing much at you in the way of a challenge, except for these guys. Fuck these guys. Level design is where things get really easy. Dark Souls is actually very judicious with its use of space, with the majority of the game taking place in more narrow corridors. Ashen is the opposite of this for the most part, so it's very easy to simply give your enemy a very wide berth as you wait for them to lean into their attack animations, and then you can follow up with a counter. Where this changes, and changes drastically, is in the first dungeon, the Seat of the Matriarch. Now, can I just say, this was one of the best experiences I've ever had in a Souls game. The Seat of the Matriarch is utterly inspired. Architecturally, it's wholly distinct from anything in the game before it, and it has a mysterious, monolithic, otherworldly quality, very reminiscent of the Vault of Glass from Destiny 1. It looks incredible, and at its base is just this endless blackness that you can kind of walk out into. It. Oh man, it's really good. Beyond that, the rest of the dungeon, it's in pitch black dark. So you're forced to take out your lantern, which means you either abandon your shield or your two-handed weapon, instantly weakening you in combat either way. Thirdly, the entire thing is comprised of dangerously narrow walkways, which falling from results in instant death, and you will absolutely fall and die a lot. Next, almost every enemy in there can two-shot you without too much difficulty, and the majority of them have a mountain of health. Even with fully leveled gear, this place feels overtuned in the best possible way. And finally, the entire thing is a giant maze that is extremely confusing to navigate even after repeated efforts to penetrate it. You will get lost in this place at least once, probably more than once, with very little to show for your detours at the end. In aggregate, the Seat of the Matriarch is the crowning moment of the entire game. It pushes every game system to its limit, and as a result, it pushes the player to the absolute limit. It really is brilliant, and I think any fan of the Souls genre is really going to enjoy it, but other fans who are newer to the genre might find it a bit overwhelming. Regardless, at the end of this dungeon, you'll bump into the game's third boss, and it's a reminder of just how disappointing boss design is in Ashen. I'm sorry to say that I one-shot the first 3 bosses in Ashen, I got the 4th in 3 attempts, and I got the last one in about 6 attempts. Ashen's bosses are a real lowlight, with simple mechanics that don't seem to want to push the player into uncomfortable territory. You can very easily just dodge and avoid their attacks and wait for openings, while your companion either tanks hits or grinds the boss down themselves. And here we get to the crux of the difficulty equation, the companion. Ashen sets itself apart from every other game in the genre because the entire game is designed to be played cooperatively, either with a specific friend that you can invite or an auto match-made person, or with an AI bot companion when neither of those two are available. The inviting of a friend thing, it just didn't work for me when I tried it on my first playthrough, but I'm told that it was broken and now it's been patched and it works now. I haven't tried it again, but apparently you can invite people to play with you. The menu says you can, so I'm going to trust it's going to work at some point. As for being auto-matched with another player on the fly, this happened to me only 3 times during my entire 20-hour playthrough, and while it was a thrill, we clearly had very different objectives each time, so it didn't really play out properly. The AI bot is surprisingly helpful. They don't get stuck on terrain too often, they don't die too often, and they'll definitely pull their weight in a fight. They'll put out real damage, but more importantly, they'll soak up hits, allowing you to reposition and find moments of opportunity. Anyone who's played Dark Souls knows how helpful it is to have an AI bot in a boss fight, or another player walking you through a section of the game. It's just as helpful here, only the entire game is built this way, resulting in an experience that feels markedly easier, like you're having your hand held throughout the entire game. The unevenness of the difficulty curve, owing to the sudden spike caused by the dungeons and the last 2 bosses, or the ease afforded by the level design and the companion, these things will, I think, frustrate players. Veterans will find the game too easy too often, where newcomers will hit walls the likes of which they've never encountered before in possibly any game they've ever played. With how focused this game is on making for an easier and more accessible experience, I think this difficulty curve could have done with some smoothing. Still, this absolutely does not spoil the experience. I absolutely loved Ashen. I thought it was awesome, and it was easily one of the best Souls-like games I've ever played. It's definitely one of the best in the genre, no question. I think its biggest achievement, beyond its approachability, is how often it prompts the player to play differently to progress. Ashen doesn't have complex weapon or RPG systems to lean into, so it instead asks you to put away your favorite weapon and use something else on occasion because you got to carry a lantern at the same time. It forces you to play in the pitch black dark. It invites you to explore ruins with its surprisingly effective traversal tools. It gives you rolling fields to explore where you can spear distant prey. Ashen's design is acutely aware of its components, and it mixes up these components in perfect measure throughout the experience, so it always feels diverse and fresh, even despite the absence of more complex game systems. Ashen is available for $40 on the Epic Games Store, or $10 as part of the Xbox Game Pass. For $10, this game is an absolute steal. Aurora 44 have immediately put themselves on the map as a formidable developer, and despite the fact that they are from New Zealand, I will gladly concede these guys made a damn fine game.